In the autumn of 1954, in a cattle market town called Harlan Creek in the hill country of central Texas, a man could lose everything he had built in 30 years in the time it took a banker to sharpen a pencil and sign his name at the bottom of a form. Harlan Creek sat in Comanche County at an elevation of 1,600 feet, surrounded by cedar and limestone and thin red soil that rewarded the patient and punished the careless. The town had grown up around a stockyard established in 1889, and for 60 years it had organized its life around cattle prices, county fairs, and the twice-weekly freight run from Brownwood. Its population in the autumn of 1954 was 1,143 people, and most of them knew each other by first name and by the names of their parents before them. There was a hardware store, a feed and grain, 2 filling stations, a courthouse built of local limestone in 1903, and a single bank, the first agricultural bank of Harlan Creek, that held mortgages on roughly a third of the working farmland in the county. The year 1954 was the 4th consecutive dry year for this part of Texas. The Edwards Plateau to the south had fared worse, and there were counties below Sasansaba where ranchers had already sold their herds at a loss and walked off land their grandfathers had cleared. In Comanche County, the situation was not quite that dire, but it was moving in that direction with a quiet, institutional patience that the land itself seemed to share. Rainfall from January through September had measured 11 inches, against a historical average of just over 23. The creeks ran low. The cedar choked the pastures that should have been grassland. Stock tanks that had held water through 3 previous dry spells finally went to mud in August and stayed there. What this meant in practical terms was that cattle operations all across the county were carrying debt they had expected to pay down with calves that had not gained weight, on grass that had not grown, sold at prices that had dropped 14% from the prior year's levels. The First Agricultural Bank of Harlan Creek had been accommodating about this in 1951. It had been moderately accommodating in 1952. By 1953, the accommodations had begun to acquire conditions. By the autumn of 1954, several of those conditions had matured into deadlines. One of the men caught in that machinery was named Edgar Pruitt. He ran 160 acres of hill country pasture and cedar clearing 9 miles southeast of town. His operation was small by any standard. 24 breeding cows, a registered bull he'd bought at considerable sacrifice in 1950, a small hay crop, and a chicken operation his wife managed that kept the household in groceries when the cattle market was unkind. The land had been in the Pruitt family for 22 years. Edgar had inherited 30 acres of it from his father and bought the remaining 130 at prices that seemed reasonable in the middle 1940s and had become a weight around his neck by 1954. He was 41 years old that autumn, and he had not had what most men would call a good year since Truman was in office. Something was wrong with Edgar Pruitt's situation. The neighbors who drove the county road past his front gate could see it in the way his fences had gone unrepaired through the summer, in the thinness of the cattle standing on the south pasture, in the way the man himself moved when he was out working. Not with the stubborn deliberateness of a man grinding through a hard season, but with the particular stillness of a man who had begun to calculate what he had left to lose. Edgar Ainsley Pruitt was born in February of 1913 in Lampasas, Texas, the second son of a man named Roy Pruitt, who had worked a hardscrabble farm east of town for 30 years without ever quite getting ahead of it. Roy Pruitt was a careful man, and a sober one, and he raised his sons with a clear set of beliefs about what a man owed the world and what the world owed him back, which was nothing, and that the distance between those two figures was where a person's character lived. Edgar absorbed this without needing to be told twice. He was a quiet boy, thin and watchful, who learned to read accounts before he learned to read for pleasure, and who understood before his 12th birthday what a note rate was and what it meant when the corn price dropped. He finished school in Lampasas in 1930, which was an unfortunate year to enter the world. He worked his father's farm through the worst of the Depression, then hired himself out as a hand on a cattle operation near Brady for 4 years, then spent 3 years in the United States Army, 1942 through 1945, the 36th Infantry Division, Italy. Coming home in the November of 1945 with a sergeant's discharge, a slight deafness in his left ear from the artillery at the Rapido River crossing, and a clear intention never to work for another man again if he could help it. He met Ruth Ann Caldwell at a church supper in Lampasas in the spring of 1946. She was a school teacher's daughter from a modest family in Burnett County who had spent the war years working at a canning plant in San Angelo. They married in October of 1946, moved into a tenant house on the east side of Comanche County, and began saving with the focused, joyless discipline of people who had seen what happened to those who did not. In 1948, Edgar bought the first 30 acres from his father's estate, the parcel his father had managed to acquire in the last years of his life. In 1950, he bought the remaining 130 from a widow named Cora Hadley, whose son had no interest in farming and who sold at a price Edgar would later describe as fair, though the note he signed with the First Agricultural Bank of Harlan Creek to finance the purchase came with a rate of 4.5% and a 15-year term that required him to be right about the cattle business for a long time running. For 3 years he was right. The Korean War kept beef prices elevated. His bull threw strong calves. Ruth Ann's chickens produced steadily. They had 2 children by 1951, a daughter named Celia, born in 1947, and a son named Thomas, born in 1950. Edgar expanded his breeding herd to 24 head, put in a water system that pulled from a spring on the northeast corner of the property, and, in the spring of 1952, made an extra payment of $275 against the principal of his mortgage. Then the rains stopped, not dramatically, not in a single season that announced itself as catastrophe, just a gradual, systematic withdrawal of moisture from the land, the way a tide goes out so slowly you don't notice until you're standing on dry sand 100 feet from where the water was. 1951 was 15 inches, 1952 was 13, 1953 was 12. And by the summer of 1954, Edgar Pruitt had sold down his herd to 19 head, drawn twice on his operating line of credit at the bank, and was looking at a November deadline on the mortgage that required him to bring his account current to the amount of $1,140. He did not have $1,140. He had, in the account at the First Agricultural Bank, $163 and some change. He had a bull that was worth perhaps $800 at current market, which was to say he could pay the bank by destroying the reproductive capacity of his operation. He had equipment, an old Ford tractor, a hay rake, a stock trailer, that might bring $500 or $600 at auction. He had the chicken flock, worth perhaps $40. He had a wife and 2 children, and 160 acres of thin red land that the bank would take in 28 days if he could not produce $1,140 by the 15th of November, 1954. Ruth Ann knew. She had been the one to open the certified letter from the bank in October, and she had read it twice and set it on the kitchen table and waited for Edgar to come in from the south pasture. He had read it once and set it down and gone to wash his hands before supper, and said nothing about it that evening or the next, and that silence told her everything she needed to know about where they stood. The First Agricultural Bank of Harlan Creek was run by a man named Calvin Doer. He had been president and principal shareholder of the bank since 1946, when he had purchased a controlling interest from the estate of the bank's founder, a man named Elias Proyetquit. No relation to Edgar, who had died, leaving his affairs in disorder and his heirs in dispute. Doer was 53 years old in 1954, a heavy-set man with a prosperous appearance who wore his suits from a tailor in Fort Worth and kept his shoes polished to a hard shine even in a town where the streets were not all paved. He had grown up in Abilene, the son of a dry goods merchant, and he had been educated at the University of Texas and spent 12 years in bank examination work for the state before acquiring the Harlan Creek Institution. He was not a cruel man in any way that the word usually implies. He was an institutional man, a man who had spent his adult life reading financial instruments and had come to understand the world largely in those terms. A note was a contract. A contract had terms. The terms existed to be honored, and when they were not honored, the remedy existed in the instrument itself. This was not personal. This was the mechanism. The mechanism worked as follows. When a borrower fell behind on a note secured by real property, the bank issued a formal notice of default. The borrower had 30 days to cure the default, to bring the account current. If the account was not brought current at the end of that period, the bank filed for foreclosure in county court. Under Texas law at the time, the foreclosure process moved on a fixed schedule: a public notice period, a waiting period, and then a trustee's sale at the courthouse steps on the first Tuesday of the following month. The whole process from default notice to auction could be completed, under favorable conditions for the lender, in 60 to 90 days. Calvin Doer had initiated this process against 5 Comanche County properties in 1953. He had completed it against 3 of them: 2 cattle operations and a dry goods store on the main street of Harlan Creek. The other 2 borrowers had found money somewhere, appeared at the bank within the cure period, and brought their accounts current. Doer had accepted their payments without comment and updated their ledgers accordingly. He did not gloat over the 3 he had foreclosed. He did not celebrate the 2 who had cured. He processed each outcome with equal administrative equanimity, the way a machine processes whatever material is fed into it. In October of 1954, he had issued default notices against 4 properties. Edgar Pruitt's was one of them. Edgar went to the bank on the 19th of October, 9 days after the notice arrived. He dressed in his good clothes, the white shirt and dark trousers he kept for church and county business, and drove his truck the 9 miles into Harlan Creek, and sat in the wooden chair across the desk from Calvin Doer for 45 minutes. He explained the dry years. He explained the calf prices. He explained the operating loan and the status of his herd, and what he believed the spring of 1955 would produce if the moisture came back. He asked for an extension of 60 days. Dorr listened to all of this. He asked 3 questions: the current head count, the outstanding balance on the operating line, the appraised value of the property. He wrote down the answers. Then he explained, with the patient courtesy of a man who has explained the same thing many times, that the bank's board had established a policy in January of 1954 regarding extensions on delinquent mortgages, and that policy did not permit extensions beyond the statutory cure period except in cases of documented natural disaster, and that while the drought conditions were significant, they had not been declared a federal disaster in Comanche County. Edgar asked if the board could make an exception. Dorr said the board met quarterly and had met in September. The next meeting was January. Edgar asked if there was someone else he could speak to. Dorr said that he himself was the decision-maker on this matter, and that his decision was consistent with the bank's policy. Edgar stood up, shook the man's hand, because that was how he had been raised, and drove back to his farm. He sat in his truck in the driveway for a long time after he parked it. Ruth Ann watched him from the kitchen window and did not go out. He tried a second door 4 days later. There was a man in Brownwood named Hargrove, who was known to broker private lending arrangements. Second mortgages, short-term notes between private parties, for borrowers who could not get terms from the banks. Edgar drove the 30 miles to Brownwood on a Thursday morning and found Hargrove in his office above a dry cleaning establishment on Commerce Street. Hargrove was polite and businesslike. He reviewed Edgar's situation for the better part of an hour and explained that the terms on which he could arrange private financing for a distressed note would require a rate of 12% and a lien position that would effectively subordinate Edgar's ownership to the lender for a period of 5 years. At 12% on $1,140 with a 5-year term and the conditions Hargrove outlined, Edgar calculated on the drive home that he would be paying money to stay in debt rather than paying down what he owed. He would be trading one form of losing the land for a slower, more expensive form of the same outcome. He drove home and said nothing to Ruth Ann about Hargrove. The 2 children had no understanding of what was happening. Thomas was 4 years old. Celia was 7, and knew that something was wrong in the way children know things. Not from what is said, but from what is not. She had stopped asking if they were going to the fair in October. She set the table without being asked and was quiet in the evenings. Edgar tried one more time. He drove to Austin on the 28th of October and spent 3 hours in the waiting area of a farm lending office attached to a state agriculture agency, waiting to speak to someone about emergency agricultural credit. He finally got 20 minutes with a young man named Dennis Kilpatrick, who explained, with genuine and helpless sympathy, that the agency's emergency lending program had been funded for 1954 at a level that was already oversubscribed, and that the next available consideration would be in the spring of 1955, contingent on the new appropriation. Edgar thanked the young man and drove back to Harlan Creek. He stopped at the filling station at the edge of town and bought a Coca-Cola and stood beside his truck, drinking it and looking at the limestone hills in the late afternoon light. And then he drove the 9 miles home and fed his cattle and came inside and ate the supper Ruth Ann had made, and afterward sat on the porch in the dark with his coffee and said nothing for a long time. There were 18 days left. John Wayne arrived in Harlan Creek on the 1st of November 1954, driving a '51 Ford pickup that was dusty from the highway and had a horse trailer behind it, empty. He came in from the north on the Brownwood Road and stopped at the Texaco on the main street to fill the tank and ask about a livestock sale he had heard of in the area. The young man at the pump told him the sale had been the week prior, which had come and gone, and Wayne thanked him and asked about a place to eat. He was not in town for a horse. That was clear enough to anyone paying attention, though not many people were at first. He had come down from his ranch operation in Palo Pinto County with no particular agenda except movement, which was sometimes what a man needed in November when the work was thin and the land was dry, and staying in one place felt like a form of submission. He had been on a buying trip for a quarter-horse stallion that had been delayed and then canceled when the seller pulled out of the deal, and he had found himself moving south on the highway with no fixed destination, which suited him fine. Wayne was 47 years old in the autumn of 1954, though he appeared somewhat older in the specific way that men who have spent decades in sun and wind appear older. The skin of his deeply weathered, the lines around his eyes cut hard and permanent, the jaw set with the particular solidity of a man who has absorbed a great deal without visibly yielding to it. He stood 6'4" in his boots and wore his size without self-consciousness. The way a door frame is what it is. He had a working ranch in Palo Pinto County of some 2,300 acres, ran Hereford cattle, employed 4 full-time hands, and had a reputation in the hill country and cross timbers region of Texas as a man who was straightforward in his dealings, and who did not speak about things he did not know, and did not act on things he had not seen for himself. He had money. This was not a secret in the circles where he moved, though he did not advertise it. He had built his operation from a smaller piece of ground he had acquired in 1938 with money from 10 years of cattle work and a timber sale from a parcel he had briefly owned in East Texas. He had no debt against his property, had not borrowed since 1944, and kept a relationship with a bank in Mineral Wells that was entirely on his own terms. The people who knew him said he could walk into that bank and draw against his account in amounts that would solve most of the problems a working rancher was likely to encounter. What had made him this way? The way he was inclined to observe before acting, to ask one question rather than 10, to stand at the edge of a situation and wait until he understood its shape. This went back to a period he did not discuss. He had been a young man in a hard circumstance in the early 1930s, and someone had intervened on his behalf in a manner that had cost that person money and earned him nothing but the satisfaction of having done it. And the effect on Wayne was not gratitude so much as a kind of permanent calibration. He knew what the weight of that kind of act felt like, and he knew what it cost. And he had been watching for an appropriate occasion to pay something equivalent back into the world for 20 years. He ate at the diner on Main Street and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and a plate of eggs and listened to what the room was saying, the way he always did in a place he didn't know. The room was saying what it had been saying for weeks: drought, debt, the bank, the notices, the names. One name came up 3 times in the 20 minutes since he sat there: Edgar Pruitt, 9 miles out. Good man, hard situation, 14 days. Wayne paid for his eggs and his coffee and left a 50-cent tip and drove his truck down to the courthouse end of Main Street, where there was a bench under an old pecan tree, and sat there for 40 minutes with his coffee cooling in his hand and watched the town move around him. He was not invisible. A man of his dimensions rarely is. But no one approached him, which suited him. He drove out the county road the next morning, a Wednesday, and found the Pruitt gate by the mailbox with the number on it. He did not turn in. He drove past slowly and looked at the fences and the cattle in the south pasture and the condition of the buildings. And he drove another half-mile and turned around and came back. He stopped on the shoulder opposite the gate for a moment and looked. Then he drove back to town. He asked 2 questions that afternoon. One was at the hardware store, where the man behind the counter had been in Harlan Creek for 30 years and knew its mechanisms. The other was at the county clerk's office, where a woman named Dorothy Haynes had been recording Comanche County documents since 1939, and where the records of every mortgage and every default notice issued in the county were available for public inspection. He did not ask either person what he should do. He asked only what was true. He was given what was true. He sat with that information for a day. He drove the Brownwood Road north for 20 miles the next morning and ate breakfast in a roadside place and came back, and the information was still true when he returned and still meant what it had meant the day before. He checked into a room at the Harlan Creek Hotel, a modest 2-story limestone building on Pekin Street that had been in operation since 1911. And sat on the edge of the bed in his hat and vest and thought about what he was and was not willing to do about a thing that was none of his business. The thing that tipped him was small. He was coming out of the Feed and Grain on Thursday afternoon, the 4th of November, and Edgar Pruitt was coming in. They passed each other in the doorway. Wayne did not know the man by sight, but he recognized the situation as clearly as if it had been labeled. A man in good clothes that were worn at the cuffs. A man moving carefully, the way men move when they have decided something they have not yet told anyone. A man who held the door for the stranger coming out and nodded once, and went in and walked directly to the counter without looking at anything on the shelves. Not browsing, not shopping, just transacting whatever last piece business required transacting. Wayne stood on the sidewalk outside for a moment. Then he went to his truck and sat in it for a while with both hands on the steering wheel. He was not a man who decided things slowly as a rule, but this was not a small thing, and it deserved to be understood before it was done. Then he went back to his hotel room and opened the saddlebag he kept in the bottom of his duffel and counted what was in it. He had $1,800 in cash, which he carried as a matter of practice when he was traveling, and might have occasion to buy livestock or equipment. He counted it twice, stacked the bills by denomination, and put them back. He dressed the next morning in the way he dressed every morning. The cavalry shirt, the leather vest, the high-crowned hat, the boots that had seen enough country to tell their own story. He had breakfast at the diner at 7, said nothing to no one beyond ordering his food, and at 9 o'clock he drove his truck to the First Agricultural Bank of Harlan Creek and parked on the street in front of it and went in. The bank occupied a narrow building of tan brick with a single large window that let in the morning light and a counter with 2 teller windows behind it. There was a loan officer's desk along the south wall, and at the back, behind a low railing and a gate of turned oak spindles, Calvin Doer's office, which had a glass upper half so that the man inside could see the floor of the bank and be seen from it. There were 3 customers in the building when Wayne walked in. A woman paying a utility bill at the first window, a man Wayne did not know waiting at the second window, and a young man of perhaps 20 sitting in the chair beside the loan officer's desk, with his hat in his hands. Wayne walked to the gate in the oak railing and opened it without knocking, and went to the door of Doerr's office and knocked twice on the frame. Doerr looked up from his desk. He was a large man, as noted, and he occupied his chair with authority. But something in the proportions of the room changed when Wayne stepped into the doorway of it. Doerr was accustomed to being the largest presence in any transaction, and he was not that now. "I'm looking for the man in charge of this institution," Wayne said. His voice was low and even, the way it always was. Doerr said he was that man and asked what he could do. Wayne said, "I'd like to talk to you about a note you're holding. Edgar Pruitt, 9 miles out on the county road." Doerr set his pen down. He looked at this man who had come in off the street on a Friday morning to discuss another man's financial affairs. And he said carefully that the bank's records were confidential and that he wasn't in a position to discuss other customers' accounts. Wayne said, "Ann, I'm not asking about his account, I'm asking about the note." Doerr looked at him for a moment. Then he said he wasn't sure he understood the distinction. "The note," Wayne said, "is a piece of paper the bank holds as security against a piece of land. I'd like to know the exact amount required to bring that account current as of today." There was a pause. In the outer bank, the woman at the first window had finished her business and gone out. The young man at the loan desk was looking at his hat. The teller at the first window was looking at the glass upper half of Doerr's office with the particular stillness of a person pretending not to. Doerr said the amount was $1,140. Nobody in that room moved. Wayne reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced a folded envelope. He opened the envelope on the edge of Doerr's desk and counted out bills. 20s and 50s, a small stack of 10s, placing them in a line along the front edge of the desk, counting aloud as he went, with the patient deliberateness of a man who had done this before and knew how it needed to be done so there was no confusion afterward. 100, 200, 300, 400. The bills lay flat on the polished desk surface. 500, 600, 700. The room was very quiet. 800, 900, 1,000. Doerr was watching the money on his desk with an expression that had moved through several registers and arrived at something that was less than comfort. 1,100, 1,200. Wayne straightened the stack. He paid the full amount. Then he paid more. He counted out $1,140 to bring the account current. And then he counted out an additional $260 against the principal of Edgar Pruitt's note. And then he laid a final $50 on the desk beside the stack and said, "That's for your paperwork and the processing fee, and whatever else this bank charges to bring a man's account out of default." Doerr said, after a moment, that there was no processing fee for curing a default. "Then it goes against his principle," Wayne said. Doerr was a man of policy and of instruments, and he recognized when a situation had passed the point at which policy was useful. He looked at the money on his desk. He looked at the man standing on the other side of it. He said he would need to prepare a receipt and a cure statement. Wayne said that would be the right thing to do. Doerr prepared the paperwork himself at his own desk, while Wayne stood in the doorway of the office and watched the main floor of the bank without saying anything. It took 11 minutes. When the documents were complete, a formal cure notice, a payment receipt, a ledger entry showing the account brought to current status with additional principal credit of $310, Doerr signed them and dated them and pushed them across the desk. Wayne did not sign them, he said. You'll note those documents are between the bank and its borrower. I'm just the man who delivered the funds. Dorr looked at him over the documents. He said slowly that he understood. I'd like that cure notice delivered to Edgar Pruitt today, Wayne said. Not by mail, by hand, Dorr said he would see to it. Wayne picked up the receipt and folded it twice and put it in his inside pocket. He turned and walked out through the gate in the oak railing, without closing it behind him, the way a man walks out of a place where he has completed his business and does not intend to return. The teller at the first window was a young woman named Marta Schaefer, who had been working at the First Agricultural Bank for 3 years. She had heard all of the foregoing through the glass. She would remember it exactly for the rest of her life. The loan officer, a man named Gene Wicks, had been watching from his desk. He was a Harlan Creek native who had grown up on the east side of the county and knew Edgar Pruitt by sight and by reputation, had known his father's land and the work it required, and had felt for the past month a particular discomfort about the Pruitt file that he had not been in a position to act on. He watched Wayne cross the floor and push out through the front door of the bank, and felt something he could not quite name. Not relief exactly, but the sensation of a room that has been holding its breath, beginning, very carefully, to let it out. Calvin Dorr sat at his desk for a moment after Wayne left, looking at the space on the desk where the money had been. Then he called his cashier in and arranged for the cure notice to be driven out to the Pruitt place by noon. It was his cashier, a young man named Robert Aldine, who was 22 years old and had been at the bank for 8 months, who made the drive. He found Edgar Pruitt on the south pasture, mending a fence section near the property line, and Edgar looked at the sealed envelope with his name on it, with the particular expression of a man who has been expecting news that will require him to start making different plans. He set his fencing tools down and opened the envelope, and read the contents standing there in the dry November grass with the cedar trees behind him and the thin sky overhead. And he read it a second time, and a third. He did not understand what had just happened. He drove to town that afternoon. He went to the bank and asked to see Calvin Dorr, and Dorr saw him and confirmed the facts of the cure notice with the administrative detachment that was his manner in all things. And when Edgar asked who had brought the funds in, Dorr said simply that a private party had arranged to cure the note on Edgar's behalf, and that the bank's obligation was to the note itself, and that the note was now current. Edgar said, "Who?" Dorr looked at him for a moment and said the name. Edgar stood there a moment. He said he didn't know the man. Dorr said it didn't appear the man knew Edgar either. Edgar Pruitt drove to the Harlan Creek Hotel on Pekin Street and asked at the desk, and was told the man he was looking for had checked out that morning. He stood at the hotel desk for a moment, then asked which way the truck had turned when it left. The desk clerk, a man named Ansel Pryor, said north toward Brownwood. Edgar drove the Brownwood Road for 12 miles, watching the highway ahead of him. He did not find the truck. He turned around and came back. He sat in his own truck in the parking area outside the hotel for a while before driving home. When he got home, he found Ruth Ann in the kitchen. He set the cure notice on the table in front of her. She read it and looked up at him, and he told her what he knew, which was not much. She put her hand on the table next to the paper and was quiet for a long time. That was the last time anyone in Harlan Creek saw John Wayne. In the diner the next morning, which was a Saturday, the cure notice and the name and the event of the prior day were the substance of every conversation. Marta Schaefer, the teller, was there having breakfast before her shift, and she told what she had heard through the glass with the accuracy of a person who had been paying very close attention. Gene Wicks, the loan officer, added what he had seen from his desk. Ansel Pryor contributed the direction the truck had gone. By Monday, the story was complete enough that people were telling it in a form that would remain largely stable over the years that followed. Nobody embellished it significantly, which was unusual. The story seemed to resist embellishment, as if adding to it would make it smaller rather than larger. The way touching a soap bubble will collapse it before you can see it properly. People told it as it had happened. A man came into the bank and paid another man's note without asking anything in return, and left before the man whose note it was could find him to say thank you. That was the story. That was all of it, and it was enough. Edgar Pruitt drove his truck to the northeast corner of his property that evening and stood at the spring for a while in the cold. The water was still running. Not much, but running. He went back to the house and ate supper and sat on the porch afterward in the dark. And for the first time in 4 months he did not calculate and recalculate the number 1140 in his head. He did not speak of it that night or the next, but he kept the paper. By the spring of 1955, the rains had returned to Comanche County with a generosity that seemed, to the people who had endured 4 dry years, almost offensive in its abundance. April brought 6 inches. May brought 4. The stock tanks filled. The cedar pastures showed new grass in the clearings. The creek behind Edgar Pruitt's south pasture, which had been running about half its normal depth since 1952, rose to its banks and ran clear. Edgar Pruitt used the winter of 1954 and 1955 carefully. He had $310 of new equity in his property, courtesy of the overpayment Wayne had left on Doerr's desk. He had the bull intact, still working. He had 19 cows that had come through the drought thinner than he liked but sound. He rebuilt 3 sections of fence on the south pasture that he had deferred in 1953. He culled 2 cows that were not producing and put the money toward a repair on the tractor that he had been putting off. By November of 1955, 1 year after the day Robert Aldine had driven the cure notice out on the county road, Edgar Pruitt had expanded his breeding herd back to 22 head. His spring-born calf crop had brought him $1,840 at the Brownwood sale. His mortgage payment was current, and his operating line of credit at the bank had been reduced by $400. Ruth Ann's chicken flock had grown to 64 laying hens and was selling eggs to 2 establishments in Harlan Creek and clearing $31 a month. In the spring of 1956, for the first time since 1950, Edgar Pruitt made an extra payment against his mortgage principal. The amount was $300, which he carried to the bank himself and counted out in front of Gene Wicks, the loan officer, who had been moved to the mortgage desk when the previous officer retired. Wicks recorded it without comment, but he looked at the ledger for a moment after he wrote it down with an expression that was its own kind of acknowledgement. By 1958, Edgar's herd stood at 28 head of registered Hereford breeding stock. His calf crop that year sold at Brownwood for $3,200. He had 7 years remaining on his mortgage. He hired a hand part-time for the busy seasons. A young man from the east side of the county named Darnell Whitfield, who was 17 and had no experience and who Edgar taught with the same patient specific manner his father had used with him. Darnell Whitfield would later say that working for Edgar Pruitt for 4 summers was the primary reason he went into the cattle business himself, and that Edgar had never lectured him about anything, never told him what kind of man to be, had only shown him the work and paid him fairly, and said so when he did something right. Darnell Whitfield ran a 700-acre operation south of Comanche by 1980 and was well regarded in the county for his fair dealing with younger cattlemen. The year 1959 brought a late freeze that killed half the county's wheat crop. It did not touch the Pruitt cattle operation. Edgar had built his holding back to a resilience that a single bad season could not undo. He had reserves. He had equity. He had a reputation at the First Agricultural Bank, now managed by Gene Wicks, who had been made president when Doer retired in 1957, as a borrower who never needed to be called. Celia Pruitt finished school in Harlan Creek in 1965 and went to Sul Ross State College in Alpine, where she studied animal science. She came home in 1969 and worked alongside her father for 2 years before her husband, a man from Menard County named Robert Gallagher, joined the operation. They built a small house on the northwest corner of the property in 1971, the year Edgar paid his mortgage off entirely. He drove to the bank that day and handed Wicks a cashier's check for the remaining balance, $412, and Wicks handed him the clear deed and shook his hand and said nothing about the nature of what had happened in the autumn of 1954 to make this day possible. He did not need to. They both knew. Edgar Pruitt died in the spring of 1984, at 71 years old, in the house he had built his adult life around. Ruth Ann survived him by 9 years. Thomas, the son, became a civil engineer and lived in Austin, but drove home to Harlan Creek twice a year and walked the property each time he came, learning the names of the pastures and the positions of the fence lines the way children learn the geography of the places that formed them. Celia Gallagher ran the Pruitt place with her husband through the 1990s and passed operational control to her own son, a young man named Edgar Pruitt Gallagher. He used his grandfather's first name, a decision he had made on his own at 16. In 2001, by then the operation had grown to 240 acres, absorbing a neighboring parcel that had come up for sale in 1977, and that Edgar Sr. had purchased without hesitation and without debt. In the summer of 1992, Celia had the deed to the original 160 acres framed. She had found it in a cardboard box in her parents' bedroom closet, with a rubber band around it and a smaller paper folded inside it. The cure notice from the First Agricultural Bank, dated November 5, 1954, stating that the account of Edgar A. Pruitt had been brought to current status by payment of $1,140, with additional principal credit of $310. The document was signed by Calvin Doer. No other name appeared on it. The frame hung in the front room of the main house on the Pruitt Gallagher place from 1992 onward, visible from the front door. Visitors who asked about it were told the same story in the same terms that had been told in the diner on that Saturday morning in November of 1954. No names were added. No details were adjusted. The teller's name, the loan officer's name, the cashier who drove out on the county road. These details were all there, recovered over the years from the people who had held them. The name of the man who had walked into the bank and paid the no doubt was too, of course, because everyone knew it. By the time Edgar Pruitt Gallagher was telling the story to his own children in the early years of the 21st century, it had been carried forward by 4 generations of people who had a stake in its accuracy. He told it the way his grandfather had told it to him, once, near the end of Edgar Sr.'s life, sitting on the porch in the late afternoon. Without embellishment, without the inflation of sentiment, with only the facts and the sequence, and the image of a tall man in a high-crowned hat walking out of a bank on a Friday morning, job done, no ceremony, not looking back. The deed and the cure notice, framed together behind glass on the front room wall of the house at the end of the county road 9 miles southeast of Harlan Creek, carry at their bottom left corner the number $1,140, written in Calvin Doerr's hand, and below it in the same hand the words "account current," and nothing more is needed to know what those words cost and what it took for them to be true, because the land around that house is still worked, the fences are still standing, the spring in the northeast corner still runs, and the name on the mailbox at the gate is still Pruitt.